Moscow, November 22, 1963. It is late at night when the cable reaches the KGB chairman Vladimir Semychastny. The American president is dead, shot in Dallas, and the shooter is a name the KGB knows far too well: Lee Harvey Oswald. The problem is not that Oswald killed John F. Kennedy. The problem is everything the KGB already knows about Lee Harvey Oswald. He defected to the Soviet Union in 1959. He lived in Minsk under KGB surveillance. He married Marina Prusakova, a Soviet citizen whose uncle was a colonel in the Ministerstvo Vnutrenih Del, the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Soviet intelligence had watched this man for years. They had opened files on him. They had debated what he was, and they had reached two conclusions, both of them catastrophic in this moment. First, they suspected Oswald was a Central Intelligence Agency provocateur, a plant sent to embarrass Moscow. Second, they judged him profoundly unstable. They were relieved when he left the Soviet Union in 1962. They thought the problem was solved. Now that unstable man, that suspected American agent, had murdered a president. And every documented connection between Oswald and the Soviet Union was a thread that, if pulled, could unravel into a conclusion no one in the Kremlin could survive. If the world decided Moscow killed Kennedy, the calculus was not diplomatic. It was nuclear, but it got worse. Buried in KGB files was a document that could never surface. After returning to America, Oswald had written to Soviet authorities requesting permission to work underground against the United States government. He wanted to join the Communist Party USA as a covert operative for Moscow. The KGB had ignored the request. They wanted nothing to do with him. But the letter existed. If American investigators found evidence of that correspondence, it would not matter that Moscow had rejected Oswald. It would look like recruitment. It would look like a Soviet intelligence operation that ended with a rifle in a sixth-floor window overlooking Dealey Plaza. Semychastny understood the stakes before dawn broke over Moscow. This was not an intelligence failure. This was an existential threat to the Soviet state, delivered by a man they had already discarded as too dangerous to use and too erratic to trust. The Kremlin's directive came fast. Attribute the assassination to anyone: Americans, Cubans, right-wing extremists, the CIA itself, anyone but Moscow. The task fell to Service A of the First Chief Directorate, the KGB's disinformation arm, the division built specifically for operations that required changing what the world believed. The active measure that followed was not ambition, it was panic. And the men who built it had less than 48 hours before the world started asking questions Moscow could not afford to answer. The panic in Moscow hardened quickly into procedure. The KGB did not improvise. It had a department for exactly this. The Kremlin's internal directive, later confirmed in the Mitrokhin archive, left no room for interpretation. Attribute the assassination to anyone else: Americans, Cubans, Texans, the CIA itself, anyone but Moscow. It did not matter who took the blame, as long as the trail led away from the Soviet Union. The problem was handed to Service A of the First Chief Directorate. This was the KGB's dedicated disinformation arm, the institutional engine behind what Soviet intelligence called active measures. Active measures were not espionage in the traditional sense. They were not about stealing secrets. They were about changing reality. Conspiracy theories, fabricated documents, planted stories, front organizations, agents of influence embedded in publishing houses and newsrooms across 3 continents. Service A had existing infrastructure, existing assets, existing channels into foreign media outlets from Paris to New Delhi to Rome. The Kennedy operation would not require new machinery. It would run on machinery already built. The timeline was brutal. By early 1964, the Warren Commission was already convening. Chief Justice Earl Warren and his panel were gathering testimony, collecting evidence, and assembling the official American account of what had happened in November 1963. Once that report was published, the narrative would begin to harden. The window to shape how the world understood the assassination, to introduce alternative frameworks before the concrete set, was measured in months, not years. Service A understood something fundamental about disinformation that most people miss. You do not need to convince anyone of a specific lie. You just need to ensure the truth never stands alone. Flood the space with competing explanations. Introduce enough doubt that no single version achieves authority. The Warren Commission could publish whatever it wanted. What mattered was what people believed after they read it. The operation had institutional backing at the highest levels. It had tradecraft refined over decades of Cold War information warfare. It had a global network of sympathetic publications ready to print stories sourced to anonymous intelligence contacts. And it had something no amount of planning could have manufactured: a target population already primed for doubt. Americans were going to question the official story whether Moscow intervened or not. Service A's job was to make sure that when those questions came, the answers pointed anywhere but east. Service A needed more than a deflection. It needed a story with internal logic so tight that pulling on any thread would only tighten the knot. In December 1963, barely a month after Dallas, the KGB reported intelligence attributed to Polish informants and a United States businessman. The claim was specific. Kennedy's assassination had been plotted by H.L. Hunt and two racist colleagues, all extreme right-wing Texas oil magnates. Hunt was not a random selection. He already had a public reputation for wild anti-communist accusations, bombastic radio broadcasts, and paranoid politics that made him a plausible villain for anyone inclined to distrust the American right. Liberal audiences did not need convincing that a man like Hunt was capable of something monstrous. They just needed a narrative that connected the dots. The KGB gave them one. The theory's architecture contained a feature that would have impressed any intelligence officer. It was self-sealing. Oswald, according to this narrative, had been chosen by Hunt's cabal precisely because his communist sympathies and Soviet connections would redirect investigators toward Moscow. The real conspirators had selected the perfect fall guy, a man whose biography pointed at the Kremlin like a loaded weapon. Every piece of evidence linking Oswald to the Soviet Union was not proof of Soviet guilt. It was proof of how cleverly Hunt's people had engineered the frame. Then came Jack Ruby. In the KGB's version, Ruby was described as a close acquaintance of Hunt. He had offered Oswald a large sum to pull the trigger. When Oswald was arrested and appeared ready to reveal he had been made the fall guy, Ruby walked into the Dallas police basement and shot him dead. Not out of patriotic rage, out of necessity. The one man who could expose the real conspiracy had to be silenced before he talked. Consider what Service A had constructed: a conspiracy theory about a conspiracy theory. If you believed Oswald acted alone, the narrative said you were falling for exactly what Hunt wanted. If you pointed to Oswald's Soviet ties as evidence of Moscow's involvement, you were doing Hunt's work for him. If you asked why Ruby killed Oswald, the answer reinforced the plot rather than undermining it. Counter-evidence did not weaken the theory, it strengthened it. Every objection could be absorbed as further misdirection, further proof of how deep the real conspiracy ran. This was not crude propaganda. This was narrative engineering, built with the precision of a counterintelligence operation. The architecture was elegant on paper. The question was delivery. And Service A had already solved that problem before the Warren Commission published a single page. The tradecraft principle was simple, and it never varied. Soviet officers did not plant stories in American newspapers directly. They never had to. The KGB maintained a network of friendly foreign press outlets, publications that would run material without asking uncomfortable questions about where it originated. L'Humanité in France. Leftist Italian weeklies with wide readership across southern Europe. Indian papers sympathetic to Moscow. The mechanism worked like a signal bouncing off a satellite. Service A would seed a narrative in Paris or Rome or New Delhi, and within weeks, American journalists citing foreign press reports would carry it home. The story entered United States discourse wearing foreign credentials, scrubbed clean of any Soviet fingerprint. Citation laundering, decades before anyone had a name for it. But overseas amplification was only half the architecture. For the domestic market, Service A needed an asset already inside the target country. It had one. Carlo Marzani was a publisher operating in New York City. He was also a KGB agent. In early 1964, while the Warren Commission was still interviewing witnesses, the KGB paid Marzani to produce and distribute a book titled Oswald, Assassin or Fall Guy. The text carried the conspiracy narrative Service A had constructed the previous December, the one blaming Hunt and his right-wing oil associates, directly into American bookshops. An American imprint, an American distributor, no Soviet fingerprints anywhere on the cover. The book sat on shelves beside domestic titles, indistinguishable from homegrown skepticism. That was the point. Simultaneously, Thomas Buchanan's 1964 book, Who Killed Kennedy, was amplifying the Texas oil magnate theory through the same network of sympathetic foreign outlets. Buchanan, an American expatriate living in Europe, wrote in English for a transatlantic audience. The KGB funded its reach, ensuring the book circulated where it would do the most damage, not in Moscow, but in London, Paris, and eventually back across the Atlantic. The boomerang completed its arc. And this is the detail that matters most. Service A was not creating belief from nothing. Americans were already skeptical of the Warren Commission before it had even convened. Polls showed doubt within weeks of the assassination. What the KGB provided was not the spark. It was the accelerant. A ready-made narrative, internally coherent, professionally published, and internationally cited, poured onto kindling that was already smouldering. The problem had never been convincing Americans to distrust their own government. The problem had been giving that distrust a specific shape. By 1965, the shape was set. The published books were the foundation. The forged documents were the accelerant. And the fire they fed was already burning on its own. By the early 1970s, the United States was devouring itself. Watergate had shattered public trust in the presidency. The Pentagon Papers had exposed systematic government deception about Vietnam. And then came the Church Committee, a congressional investigation that pulled back the curtain on decades of CIA wrongdoing under Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. Assassination plots against foreign leaders, domestic surveillance programs, covert operations that violated the agency's own charter. Prestigious American newspapers and magazines wrote about CIA corruption extensively, with no prompting from Moscow required. Service A watched this unfold and recognized something extraordinary. They did not need to manufacture American skepticism. They just needed to aim it. In the 1970s, the KGB circulated a forged letter purportedly written by Lee Harvey Oswald to E. Howard Hunt, the CIA officer who had become infamous for his role in the Watergate break-in. The forgery was calculated with surgical precision. Hunt was already a national symbol of covert government criminality. Linking him to Oswald and linking Oswald to the CIA created a narrative chain that felt not just plausible but inevitable in the post-Watergate atmosphere. The American public was already primed to believe the worst about its own intelligence services. The forged letter simply gave that belief a name and an address. This was the critical operational insight that made the KGB's campaign different from ordinary propaganda. Service A was not creating suspicion from nothing. It was pouring accelerant on genuine fire. The Church Committee was independently uncovering real CIA abuses. Real journalists were publishing real investigations. The KGB's contribution was specific and deliberate. It gave American doubt an architecture, a villain, and a self-reinforcing narrative frame that merged seamlessly with legitimate domestic investigations. Where the Church Committee found institutional arrogance and illegal operations, Service A ensured that those same patterns seemed to explain Dallas. Every revelation about CIA assassination plots abroad made the idea of a CIA assassination at home feel less like conspiracy theory and more like logical extension. The KGB did not need Americans to trust Soviet sources. It needed Americans to distrust their own government. And by the mid-1970s, that problem had solved itself. By 1967, the seeds Service A had planted were bearing fruit in soil the KGB never tended. And the gardeners were American. In March of that year, New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison announced he had solved the assassination of President Kennedy. The conspiracy, Garrison claimed, ran through the CIA, through anti-Castro Cuban exiles, through a shadowy network of intelligence operatives working inside the United States. He prosecuted a New Orleans businessman named Clay Shaw, charging him with conspiracy to murder the president. The trial lasted from 1967 to 1969. Shaw was acquitted in less than an hour of jury deliberation. But the acquittal did not matter. What mattered was the frame. Garrison was not a Soviet asset. He had no contact with Service A. He worked from domestic sources and genuine investigative instinct. But the framework he operated inside, the architecture of suspicion that cast the assassination as a CIA-connected domestic conspiracy, had been prepared years earlier. The oil magnate theory, the fall guy narrative, the idea that Oswald was a patsy manipulated by powerful American interests. These were themes Service A had been seeding since early 1964, through foreign press, through funded publications, through the slow drip of planted stories that migrated back into American discourse wearing American clothes. Garrison did not need Moscow to hand him a script. The script was already in circulation. Then came something Service A could never have engineered on its own. In 1976, the United States Congress convened the House Select Committee on Assassinations. For 3 years, American legislators, American investigators, and American forensic analysts re-examined the murder in Dallas. In 1979, the committee issued its final report. Based on acoustic evidence from a Dallas police motorcycle microphone, the committee determined that a conspiracy was probable. President Kennedy was likely assassinated as a result of a plot involving more than one gunman. An official body of the United States government had now ratified the core premise of the active measure, not because Moscow told it to, not because KGB officers testified, because an investigation operating within a landscape of doubt that Service A had spent 15 years cultivating arrived at the destination the operation was designed to reach. The conspiracy conclusion entered the permanent congressional record. It was cited in textbooks, referenced in journalism, and treated as established fact by millions of Americans who had never heard of Service A and never would. Moscow no longer needed to defend its distance from Lee Harvey Oswald. American institutions were doing that work themselves. On December 20, 1991, director Oliver Stone released a film called JFK. It was a $200 million production, and it did something no intelligence operation on Earth could have purchased at any price. It embedded the CIA conspiracy framing of the Kennedy assassination into the permanent consciousness of the American public. Stone built his film from entirely domestic materials. Jim Garrison's memoir, American Investigative Journalism from the 70s. The House Select Committee record that had concluded a conspiracy was probable. He drew on the Church Committee findings about CIA wrongdoing, the same institutional wreckage that had made KGB active measures so effective a decade earlier. Stone had no contact with Soviet intelligence. He needed none. The narrative architecture Service A had constructed in 1964 had, by 1991, become so thoroughly naturalized in American discourse that a mainstream filmmaker could assemble it from sources sitting in public libraries. The film reached tens of millions of Americans in theaters alone. It told them what many already suspected, what congressional investigations had half confirmed, what a generation of books and magazine articles had repeated until repetition felt like proof. The CIA killed Kennedy. The Warren Commission covered it up. Oswald was a patsy. Every one of those themes traced a lineage back to Service A's early operations, the Fall Guy framework, the intelligence community cover-up, the powerful domestic conspirators who silenced witnesses. These were the bones of the theory the KGB had seeded through foreign press outlets, funded through publishing assets like Carlo Marzani, and amplified through forged documents in the 1970s. But by the time Stone put them on screen, they were not Soviet anymore. They were American. They felt American. They had been carried forward by American filmmakers, American publishers, and American audiences who believed, with complete sincerity, that they were thinking for themselves. The impact was immediate and measurable. Congress, responding to public pressure generated largely by the film, passed the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992, mandating the release of classified documents related to the assassination. A Hollywood movie had changed federal law. Stone had accomplished in 3 hours of cinema what the KGB had spent decades building toward, and he had done it without knowing they had ever started. The operation no longer needed operators. It had reached escape velocity, self-sustaining, self-amplifying. Running on its own fuel inside the country, it was designed to destabilize. Service A was disbanded when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the same year JFK opened in American theaters. But before the archive closed forever, one man had already been copying it by hand for 30 years. Vasily Mitrokhin was a senior archivist for the KGB's first chief directorate. For 3 decades, he had secretly copied operational files by hand, smuggling his notes home in his shoes and under his clothing. In 1992, he walked into the British Embassy in Riga, carrying the documentary skeleton of Soviet intelligence. British Secret Intelligence Service extracted him and his archive. The material was extraordinary. Inside those handwritten pages sat the operational history of Service A, including the sustained campaign around the Kennedy assassination, the Marzani publishing operation, the Active Measures Doctrine, the systematic effort launched in November 1963 and refined through early 1964 to attribute the killing to anyone but Moscow. Cambridge historian Christopher Andrew co-wrote the resulting book, published in 1999 as The Sword and the Shield. For the first time, the West had documented evidence of what Service A had done. But consider the timing. By 1999, the conspiracy theories had been American for a generation. The Warren Commission had been doubted for 35 years. Jim Garrison had prosecuted his case. The House Select Committee had concluded a conspiracy was probable. Oliver Stone had made his film. Congress had passed a law. The narrative had long since left Moscow's hands, traveled through American institutions, American courtrooms, American movie screens, and American living rooms, until it felt as native as the grassy knoll itself. The Mitrokhin archive confirmed what had happened, but confirmation arrived into a world the operation had already reshaped. The KGB is gone. The Soviet Union is gone. The men who ran Service A are dead, But every November, Americans still argue about Dallas using frames drawn in Moscow 60 years ago. The fall guy, the intelligence community cover-up, the powerful domestic interests who silenced the truth. Those frames did not emerge from the evidence. They were engineered, seeded, funded, and amplified by a foreign intelligence service working in a language it did not speak, inside a country it could not enter. That is not a cold case. That is a ghost operation, still running, long after the operators have left the building.